Hey, Mike, can you hear me in 1011 or 6022?
Can you hear us in 1011? I apologize. We're just flipping the room over from another session.
Yeah, no sweat. I hear you, Mike. Do you got me?
I can hear you fine. Okay, let me just turn you up a bit. Thanks. Are we clear though, Chris, coming in?
Yeah, you're clear.
Fantastic.
And I have your presentation as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started this afternoon. Sorry for the delay. We had some learners in the classroom today. So welcome to everybody. My name is Yolanda Wanakamik, and I am the Director of Indigenous Affairs. I'm a member of the White Sand First Nation, which is situated in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. I'm the granddaughter to Josephine and the daughter to Annette. My mother and her siblings all attended residential school. I am grateful every day for my family members who have returned home and mourn those who have not. Today I'm situated on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, and I kindly ask you to reflect and learn about the land you are on today. Land acknowledgements are important because they raise the awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in Canada, and create an opportunity for those acknowledging the land to learn the truth about colonialism in Canada. The medical schools buildings at Laurentian and Lakehead University are located on the territory of the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg, the Wanatapé First Nations, and Fort William First Nations. And as we begin today, I'd like to invite Nookomis Julie to open us up in a good way. Julie?
Oh, miigwech. I'm just going to begin with lighting a smudge here. This helps with our healing to cleanse our mind and cleanse our heart, and to make room for all the words that we're going to hear today, and so that we join with each other and have that respect and that love for each other, and the kindness and the caring that we have for each other. As Yolanda had mentioned, I'm Julie Ozawagosh. I'm from Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg. I too am a residential school survivor. I'm second generation. So it's an honor to be with you today, and to listen, and have the opportunity to have that awareness and education of what truth and reconciliation means for us, and for for Canada, and for all the people that have it in their heart to learn, and to have that compassion for our people. Aha, miigwech. Ha bonjour. Wabban an kwende de go jijaak do de. Jamnedo mishom sak nok misak. Say mangi mina go me wibbenat nagi ang she bangi. Jamnedo mishom sak nok misak. Miigwech niket me minog yam da mag manda gijgat. Miigwech ke manda be matsewen. Miigwech ke nissewen. Miigwech ke niguke go gab nijam. Miigwech ke niket me Jesus minog eki benabian. Miigwech ke niket me nebi uptake it was octoing wishanagadenni. Mi manda ka mina go zing manda be matsewen. Miigwech ke niket mishkak makwe ke gishanagaden min manda kinege go book now with cause ya mocking. Shemnedo mishom sak no misak. Mekwen manana ge benoji ganesh kinijik. Ki wijam tamot ge manda be matsewen. Minoge mekwen manana ge oxygen. Minoge bakti mayajik. Ke wijam tamot ge manda be matsewen. Minoge mekwen manana ge oshakan majajik. Shemnedo mishom sak no misak. Uptake nungo ni mekwen manana ge benoji koda gamke gasot nungo. Ge wede wishinigi at wede wishadag den bezot ge the ke one shot. The chinen me. On the Kanigo nungo Asia. Not much tangi in we wim squeezing. When they gave we sham to me man the Kanigo gego. Jam the door mishom suck nok misak. Mekwen manana ge shamang the shek me no shamang the square go the chawas any got out shot or the on just give up scabi gun and this guy. Me man the got me to go sing man the matsawin. Jam the door mishom suck nok misak. Not much tang the ske we bapping, me no ge we dumnyang up to gain the shin mandem shkiki. Jam the door mishom suck nok misak. Not much English man the canoe get away we should adopt them. We should wait to him man the canoe man the kid winning. We gave wood bat mataring under the king. We which game up here can gay and amjadick. Gay we shall know more game on the canoe gay we should back the man. Archie me which man the go man the gijagat. Ah me gwetch. So we give thanks to the Creator, to the grandmothers and the grandfathers for this beautiful day that we woke up to, for this breath that we have, for this life that we have. We also give thanks to the water, for it is our responsibility to take care of that water. It's for that life that we have today. We also thank the grandmothers, the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers to look down upon us and to guide us as we sit here together. We also give thanks to Mother Earth for everything that she provides for us upon her back so that we could have this good life. We ask the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers to help remind us to help our children and our youth so that they too could have this good life. And for the ones who are sick and the ones who are incarcerated, that they too could have this good life. We also think about the ones who've already gone on to the spirit world, that we don't forget about them. We ask the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers to really today to especially think about the children that were uncovered and to realize the truth of the residential school, and that healing will begin for the families to bring their little loved ones home. We ask the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers to remind us to play, to laugh, for all of that is good medicine. And we also ask the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers, that for all of us that are sitting together to listen to these words, the stories, and that we take them to heart and to listen and to find that love and caring, compassion for everyone that we have in our circles, and especially to help those little ones, as they make their journeys home, to think about those families who can have closure. We ask the Creator, the grandmothers and the grandfathers, to guide us as we sit here to listen to the truth and accept that truth, and to show that love and caring for each other. With all of that, we say miigwech to this beautiful day. Aha, miigwech, miigwech, miigwech.
Miigwech, Julie, thank you so very much for starting us off in such a good way. You're very much appreciated, and your love and support is welcome. So good afternoon. Once again, I want to extend a warm welcome to our two special guests. I have the honor of being in the same room with one of them, Dr. Scott Hamilton, and of course, Dr. Kona Williams, who will be joining us. For many years, Orange Shirt Day was held annually on September 30th as an opportunity for Canadians to learn more about the legacy of the residential school system. And on June 3rd, 2021, the Government of Canada officially designated September 30th as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This was a recommendation from the TRC's Commission Call to Action number 80, which states, "We call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish a statutory holiday, a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and the legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process." The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation encourages Canadians to work together towards reconciliation and to hear that truth that Julie just spoke about, of the survivors who are sharing their stories for our learning. I want to say a big chimigwech to the Planning Committee for all their work that they've brought to NOSM again this year, with leadership from Sally Manag, Ashley Laframboise, Laura Lee McGregor, Danielle Barbeau-Rodrigue, Jennifer Fawcett, Kimberly Larkin, Laura Mallet, and Terry Hawks. And I would like to also say a big thank you to the NOSM Library for gathering and sharing resources with all of you locally and across the nation as we tweeted about all of these resources that were available. And to the communications for such communication about this day and about all the work that we are doing at NOSM. And I would be completely remiss if I didn't say thank you to the IT department for all that you do every day, trying to understand all of these systems, and I'm never sure where to look, but I'm appreciative to have somebody here to help support. It's great to see so many of you wearing orange shirts today. I would like to let you know that all the proceeds from the sale of the shirts are going to a new Indigenous student bursary here at NOSM, and it's called the Truth Award. As of today, this morning, we sold 481 of our 500 shirts available. There's a few extras that are left. We also have some buffs and snoods that are still available at the Nawesome store as well, so you're welcome to look at those. Maybe they'll come a little more handy when you're outside running or doing your outdoor activities as fall comes upon us. The artwork on the t-shirts comes from artist Isaac Murdoch, and the shirt states, "Bring the children home, it's time." Isaac said that the shirt is a rendering of what is believed to be hundreds of years of pictograph discovered near the site of the residential schools in Spanish west of Sudbury. And you can read more about the artist rendering on the NOSM website. We are still very much in a truth-telling era, and we need to hear these stories that are being shared. So I thank you all for being here today to listen and to learn. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Sarita Verma, NOSM's Dean, President, and CEO, to say a few words. Dr. Verma?
Miigwech, Yolanda, Miigwech, Nookomis, Julie, for starting us in such a good way and for your words of wisdom. Anim, bonjour, hello, bonjour to everybody. This is just amazing. It's an honor to be here. I also want to say miigwech to the Creator to help guide us through the truth. For me, September 30th is a very meaningful day for other reasons as well. It is the anniversary of the passing of my mother, who was very devoted to truth and reconciliation. And she would be on this journey with us as we learn about residential schools. I think that reflection about this truth and reaching peace is part of the journey. And with the awareness that is happening in Canada about the children who died at residential schools, we want to tell the stories, but we also recognize that this could re-traumatize some of you and others. So please know that we are with you, and there are many resources available to you. As NOSM, and as we become a university, the role is so important in bringing to attention to the death of Indigenous children and this dark chapter, but enlightening people about the 60s scoop and the children even currently in the welfare system. We as an educational institution have a responsibility to ensure that all of us, especially if I might say those who are not here, those who do not take the opportunity. So let's spread our ability to engage them so that next year there are more. And that next year, in fact, this occurs on September 30th, rather than seeing it as a holiday, but as a day to celebrate and to reflect and to make it a meaningful activity for all of the people at NOSM. Residential and day schools operated in Canada for over 100 years, and from 1840 to 1996, more than 150,000 children went through the system. These Indigenous children were identified in the TRC's Missing Children and Unmarked Burials Project report, which confirmed at that time 3,200 confirmed deaths, but we know that in fact that may be double. And as these unmarked burial sites are identified, they allow medical students, trainees, staff, faculty, and everyone at NOSM, dietetics, physician assistants, all of our learners to think about what this loss would mean to all of us as parents, brothers, sisters, and children. What I find disturbing is that these schools did not actually exist to teach and to encourage learning, as we say we do at NOSMU, but they were there to eradicate and eliminate culture. And, you know, the elimination of culture, the taking of children, cutting ties to cultural teachings, and forced assimilation continues. And if we do anything, let's pledge today that we will be part of the solution, that part of our values, respect, inclusivity, social accountability, will be to fight to eradicate racism and the elimination of culture. For some of you, you will be hearing stories, and I hope you will learn over today and tomorrow. But don't forget, it's not just one day. It should be all the time at nauseam. Our culture should be about actually embracing this and building it into our lives. We live this, we see this. I am in Thunder Bay right now on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, and our school is on the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And we have a greater obligation than any other university to be part of the solution. I want to thank Csi Effect, to communications, IT, to the library, to the planning committee, all named by Yolanda, as well as the whole Indigenous Affairs Unit, because you are our richness. I also, Csi Effect, to Scott and Kona for being with us today and for sharing their wisdom. I also thank all of you for being here and making the time to learn, and the survivors who are with us today. Share with us. Tomorrow is the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and I said I do not consider this to be a holiday. I believe this should be a day where, although we are closed, we should spend the day next year planning events all day, and that this should be part of making ourselves learned and rich. Wherever you are in your learning journey, thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, Yolanda, Scott, Kona, Nookomis, Julie, and I will hand it back to you, Yolanda.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. So, as I said, I have Dr. Scott Hamilton here in the room with me at the Thunder Bay campus. So Dr. Scott Hamilton is a professor of anthropology at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, and I consider Scott a very good friend of mine. We've known each other for many years. He specializes in Northern Plains and subarctic Indigenous archaeology, the fur trade, and ethnohistory. Coming from a background in archaeological consulting, Dr. Hamilton continues to divide his time between applied and academic research, with a strong emphasis on community-engaged research in subarctic First Nations. Recent research interests have focused on remote sensing applications to archaeology, employing near-surface geophysics, aerial photogrammetry, and underwater sonar mapping. It probably is a really big word for something pretty simple. He also conducted research on behalf of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission, addressing the location and nature of cemeteries and burial places associated with the schools. Thank you for this work, Dr. Scott Hamilton. And the title of his presentation today is The Legacy of the Indian Residential School System. How did we get ourselves into this situation? And without further ado, Dr. Hamilton. Did I do it? Nope. Why was it done? There.
That would do it. There we go.
I did it.
You did it.
You did it.
So I can just use the arrow keys to advance and, okay. I'm going to lose the mask so I can breathe. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. And thank you, Elder Julie, for opening this. When I reflected on what I wanted to talk about today, I kind of thought about how the last several months have unfolded since the Kamloops news essentially shook the world. And I thought mostly about wanting to talk not so much about my work for the TRC, but rather in response to the kind of response that has occurred in Canada over the last several months. And I wanted to talk very bluntly about some painful truths about Canada, Canada's history, and the systemic racism that underlies so much of how we got ourselves into this situation. And this forced me to think about it more from a historic contextual perspective. What is the nature of Canada as these schools were established and perpetuated for over 150 years? And what are the themes and pressures that contributed to this system? And how does this reflect how Europeans thought about the rest of the world? And to a large measure, how Euro-Canadians still continue to reflect about their place in the world. What are the consequences? What are the outcomes? And it becomes very clear that much of this legacy is something that still remains with us. It's in the 1930s that the schools reached their peak numbers. And it was very clear throughout most, if not all, of that history of the system, the primary objective was to accelerate the assimilation of Indigenous people into Euro-Canadian mainstream Canada. And their objective was to achieve that goal through indoctrination of the children. When you look at a lot of the historic imagery and propaganda that comes out of this time, we see many, many images of before versus after. But very seldom do we know the biographies, the identities of the children that are illustrated. Thomas Kieczyk is a wonderful example of that phenomenon. We see this image, this pair of images in many of the documents. Very few people realize that he died very shortly after the photograph on the right was taken. He got sick, he got TB, and he was sent home and died very shortly thereafter. These schools are distributed all across Canada, but are particularly prominent in Western Canada and in the Canadian North. There's only 2 schools in Southern Ontario and only 1 that's recognized as part of the TRC Commission's mandate in the Maritimes. There are many other places beyond these dots that are identified as part of the TRC mandate. How do we address, as Canadians, this legacy of harm that we've inherited? Well, I think, first of all, we need to recognize the bureaucratic, administrative, political policy directions that drove this process. The objective was to transform Indigenous communities into something else. And this was, all of the weight of the federal government was brought to bear to achieve this goal. And when we look at some of the historical quotes from important figures in the history of the residential school system, that objective becomes very stark and apparent. It's something that we cannot forget. This was a deliberate policy of Canadians. But very early on, within 20 or 30 years of the significant uptick in the numbers of schools being operated and financed by the federal government, there were whistleblowers talking about the consequences, the epidemiological consequences. Most important is Peter Bryce, who was appointed as the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Interior. And very early in his mandate, he underwent a kind of an inspection tour of residential schools across Western Canada. And he documented very meticulously the appalling conditions that these children were facing. He was describing the unimaginable mortality rate among these children and wrote a report expecting that things would be addressed and made better. To his surprise and horror, he was essentially blackballed and driven out of the public service because he was speaking truth to power that the powerful were uncomfortable with. This resulted in the system persisting for pretty close to 3/4 of a century after the submission of his report. We can see in this demographic chart the consequences in terms of mortality, but it hides the morbidity problem. The fact that many of these children returned to their communities carrying disease. Many of these children who survived were unable to integrate with their communities. This is the basis of the ongoing multi-generational trauma of the schools. In terms of the death rate, we don't see the death rate in the schools approaching the normal level of death rate within children in Canada until after the 1950s. So, if the Canadian government knew this was the situation in 1905, 1907, if Canadians in general knew after the publication of Bryce's report in 1920, why did this system continue? Why did it continue until pretty close to the end of the 20th century? In large measure, it's because of the enduring policies and the bureaucratic continuity of the federal government system, with its primary focus upon assimilation. But it also reflects a whole series of other underlying phenomena that are much more difficult and quite painful to hang on to. It reflects upon the long-term consequences of imperialism and colonialism. And it also reflects a 19th century unshakable faith in the superiority of Western European civilization. And essentially, my discipline and many other social sciences disciplines bear a burden of blame as part of this process. Why? Well, in the 1860s, as Darwinian biological evolution became a revolutionary new way of thinking about the evolution of species, a number of other disciplines, including the emerging social sciences, embraced evolution as a wonderful explanatory tool. It's sort of like the WD-40 of social theory. It became a means by which we could comprehend human diversity, and it also became a means of kind of validating and rationalizing the inherent racism of the colonial societies. The problem was the social sciences did not understand what biological evolution was. They were thinking of it as a process of progress, of improvement, of perfectibility towards a specific goal. And what was that agenda? Well, it involved a simple to increasingly complex social evolutionary trajectory. We all are familiar with the terms savagery, barbarism, and civilization. These were fundamentally established, widely accepted notions in the social sciences that became kind of rationalized and accepted as a means of validating colonialism, of validating systemic racism. Now, the question is, did these ideas die with the 19th century, or do they persist into contemporary society? I picked on a recently published book that was not particularly successful in terms of selling copies, but it captures the enduring resonance of many of these 19th century ideas. This is a series of quotations from Conrad Black's response to criticism from his book that he titled The Rise to Greatness, The History of Canada from the Vikings to the Present. This title captures the essence of his perception of Canada and its rise to greatness. It rose to greatness primarily because white folks showed up. When you read the underlined, highlighted text, you can see very clear 19th century unilineal cultural evolutionary themes that persist, that are tropes, that are commonly accepted concepts that still unthinkingly remain with us. This, of course, is one of the primary rationales underlying many of the calls to action within the TRC report. This notion of the importance of widespread and systematic education about Indigenous culture and Indigenous history to counter this kind of thinking. So what does the Indian residential school system look like as a historic phenomenon? In many cases, it predates modern Canada. And we can see from the maps how Canada developed and transformed as a nation state. And we can see many wee dots scattered across Western Canada and the North that actually predate the formation of the provinces. In many cases, there are a few that predate the purchase of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. The residential school system accelerated in its impact and investment as the
Sorry, we lost audio here in 107 or on WebEx.
Sorry, the speaker has been muted for some reason.
1011, please unmute.
Dr. Hamilton, I don't know if someone's told you, you're on mute. We cannot hear you.
Test, can you hear us? Test, test.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Michael, we can hear you now.
Okay, so we are back with sound. All right, I saw a thumb. All right, so I think I left off somewhere here talking about the chart in the lower right. And one can see the red arrow pointing to around 1945, 1950. That's when the available records indicate that there's a systemic decline in the rate of death within these schools. This is probably a consequence of the post-Second World War availability of antibiotics and the development of a much more effective public health system across Canada. But you'll also note when you look at the chart that the mortality rate, the annual rate, wildly fluctuates from year to year to year to year. This is probably reflecting the flawed and incomplete records that are available as part of the TRC investigations. We don't know how many children died, simply because the records are so poor. So this leaves us with the part about the legacy. What are the consequences of the residential school system? And these are very well known to us, but it's important to put a human face on these circumstances. And it also is important for us to realize that we've known for a very long time what those tragic consequences are. Official Canada knew about it in 1907. Indigenous communities knew about it long before that, but they were powerless to influence the authorities to change the system. There was no public acknowledgement and no apology until 2008. And the 2015 release of the TRC reports made it very widespread and known. But we still don't know how many children died in these schools or as a consequence of attending these schools. We don't know the names of many of the deceased that we do know about, and we don't know the fate of the many thousands of children that disappeared while attending these schools. They never returned to their home communities. Now, these are very haunting questions that drive much of the contemporary debate and questions of the last few months about what are the residential schools and what happened to those children. Now, my work with the TRC began in 2013 when I was asked to address the question of where are the cemeteries? What do we know about them? What are their condition? And my exercise was a desktop exercise, and it was focused upon remote sensing interpretation. And that required me first to kind of get into the context, the historical and the epidemiological context, using the research of other researchers who were working for the TRC. My observations are pretty stark and are reflected in the gray box on the right-hand side. Communicable disease was rampant in these schools. The conditions of life within those schools, the diet, the treatment of the children, all contributed to a pretty horrific place, or places, because remember, there's at least 150 of these places. So what now? In the spring of 2021, several First Nations communities undertook cemetery investigations using near-surface geophysical methods on schools that they controlled. The results got picked up in the public press quite quickly, and it reached national and international attention. But quite frequently, the story would get spun and out of control. And it left many communities wondering, what is all of this? What is real? And what is propaganda? And what is spin doctoring? It also forced the provincial and federal governments to begin identifying funds to enable continued research, to investigate these places. But how to undertake that work? What are the methods? What are the chances that these methods will work? How do communities build research connections and capacities to undertake the work? And much of my summer has been spent as part of a group of people who are doing briefings to communities, to government agencies, about what is the process. Oh, yeah. What is the process? How does one do this work? And what is the strength and capacity of these methods for answering questions? And a lot of this involves providing plain speak explanations of what are the technologies that might facilitate this documentation process. Many of these technologies are quite expensive and quite sophisticated and require trained operators. And some of these methods that are out there have never been tried in addressing something as complicated and as subtle and as ephemeral as the unmarked graves of children. How do we know what we know when we use these methods? Some of my work has involved messing about with satellite imagery and also messing about with drones as a means of capturing high-resolution photography from the air of these places to try and detect indications of graves. Sometimes this is extraordinarily successful in circumstances where the ground is properly prepared. Now, this is data that I was allowed to share that was produced for BNA First Nation in the Lake Nipigon Basin. And they asked me to fly one of their historic cemeteries that kind of mimics the circumstance that we might expect in these residential school cemeteries. It's a very old cemetery. Most of the wooden crosses are gone, and our best indication are the collapsed grave shafts as the grave settles. And these are a series of drone air images that have been processed to produce microtopographic maps. The isoclines that you see, the contour lines, represent relief change of 5 centimeters. And when we look at the distribution of those red arrows, you get a sense of where there are very subtle depressions that may represent collapsed graves. Here is an indication of how we might think about documenting these currently undocumented cemeteries. Other methods involve the use of ground-penetrating radar as one of these methodologies. And this is an instrument that projects a radar beam into the ground, and then you analyze the reflections, the rebounds back as the radar beam detects unconformities, changes in the sediment texture. It doesn't detect a grave, it doesn't detect a body, but rather it detects changes in the soil texture. And this is the primary method that has been most widely used in these investigations so far. Now, the image that you see animated on the right is essentially a slice down through the radar data showing the grave shafts that are detected in this particular set of data. We have an uncomfortable faith an unthinking faith in the value of science and technology to get us the answer. In forensics, it's often referred to as the Csi Effect. We all watch television where in 43 minutes every Tuesday night, a crime is solved and the guilty are identified. It does not happen like that. These methodologies require a very, very sophisticated level of analysis and interpretation, and the collection and processing and management and interpretation of vast quantities of data. This is not something you can do on your laptop. There's very few people in Canada who have well-established expertise in the use of these methods for the detection of something as subtle as unmarked graves of children. And we're facing a major problem. How do we critically address the data quality? What's a false positive versus a false negative? And which of those sources of error is worse in science? Well, in this case, obviously, a false negative is worse. How do you evaluate these risks and identify multi-proxy approaches for data interpretation in order to generate the most reliable, credible, and useful data in identifying these lost children? These are the challenges that the communities that are engaging in this kind of research are facing right now. How do we know what we know? How do we detect correctly the unmarked graves of children? How do we correctly filter out the non-grave noise? And how do we evaluate the circumstances where graves are there, but they're invisible to the methodology? These are really tough science questions. The residential school sites vary in circumstance across the country. In some circumstances, the schools are gone. Sometimes they're still standing. Sometimes they're abandoned hulks. Sometimes they've been repurposed for different purposes. Some of the grounds are redeveloped and transformed. Other cases, they lie abandoned. This next series that I'm going to show you are merely 6 examples of residential schools in Canada of the over 150 locations that I'm sure will require investigation. First of all, a very old residential school site that was abandoned in 1929 and has essentially grown back to brush. Where's the school grounds? Where's the unmarked graveyard? How do we find it? How do we undertake that investigation? These are really difficult tasks. This is a circumstance that looks much more straightforward. It's a circumstance where the church, the residential school, and the cemetery are in very close proximity. But we also have a circumstance that in that known cemetery, there are the graves of children who died while attending school, but there are also the graves of community members, members of that church parish, who are also buried in that churchyard cemetery. How do you sort out the graves? In this circumstance, as occurs in Thunder Bay, we have 3 discrete locations for the residential schools through time. And in each of those locations, we know there was a cemetery. Where are those places? Where are the schools? Where are the cemeteries? How do we find them? This is the Mohawk Institute, the oldest residential school in Canada. The last iteration is still standing and is reutilized as a cultural institute by 6 Nations. They have a large ground, some of which is grassed, some of it is brushed, but no clear sense where the cemetery might be located. That's a lot of ground to investigate. In other circumstance, the school is eradicated, knocked down, and abandoned, and is overgrown and is slowly regenerating back into forest. Just like that first scene, how do we find it? How do we build an information base in order to focus the search to specific candidate areas. And of course, there are other places where the grounds have been repurposed into new kinds of facilities and obscure and eradicate all evidence of the former residential school. And we are completely dependent upon survivors to give us indications where their memories point to candidate areas that are needing further investigation. So there's a series of emerging principles here. Everyone, 5 minutes, perfect. Everyone agrees that these investigations must be led by the Indigenous communities who are most affected by this history. These children come from multiple different First Nations communities, and many communities lost children in each school. There needs to be a nation-to-nation discussion within First Nations to figure out the best practice, the best approach. The identified federal and provincial money is going to be insufficient for the task. Essentially, what we're looking at is many years of work in order to address the question of where are the children buried. And this, of course, risks recurring trauma for the survivors and the families of the missing and the deceased. There are a number of potential pathways that we might follow, and we're still very much in a process of figuring out the best strategy that is going to have to be purpose-built for each individual school circumstance. And I think I'm going to stop there and throw the floor open for any questions. And I have no idea how we're going to make this work. Okay. Are there any questions that anyone might have? I'm sure there will be disembodied voices coming from somewhere. Either we have a technical glitch or crickets.
Dr. Verma is asking, is there a respectful ceremony at each site where there is an investigation?
That is my expectation, that the communities will decide that as an important part of the protocol before any direct investigations occur. But remember, these are very much discussions in progress, and I'm not party to most of those discussions. I have no real idea of what various communities are planning.
I have a question from the East. Hi, I'm Chloe. To your knowledge, how much, is the burial site being found really being prioritized by the government right now? Where is the, I guess, like emphasis and the urge coming from? Like, is this something that we can see becoming really more developed and worked on in the next year, or is it going to be something that's just pushed aside? If you have knowledge on that.
I changed my perspective almost on a daily basis. I really don't know where this is going to go. When the TRC released its reports in 2015, I figured that would trigger reaction. Not much happened. 2021, a different kind of public awareness and public pressure has been brought to bear. We're going to have to wait and see if there is follow through, if there is action. But we also have to remember that communities are facing an enormous struggle in trying to figure out best way forward. Who do we consult? Who do we achieve consensus with in order to come up with a strategy for each of these schools? And there will be differences of opinion within each individual community, and there will be differences of opinion between communities. This is a very, very long process of communities grappling with the knowledge that they have available and coming up with a strategy that makes sense for those communities that are directly affected. This is not going to be fast, easy, or straightforward. I think we're done.
And we're on time with the technical difficulties.
Oh, wow, that's good.
Thank you very much, Scott. So thank you, everybody out there, wherever you are in the world today, for your patience as we dealt with the technical difficulty. And just thank you so very much, Scott. Every time I hear you speak, I feel like I learn so much more about the reality of the state of the world in regard to residential schools and where we're at. And I really appreciated your plain speak. I was listening to Marie Sinclair this morning speaking with Rosanna Deerchild from CBC Radio and talking about the TRC's calls to action. And one of the impetuses for developing that report was to ensure that it was written in plain speak so that Canadians can do something with it. So again, appreciate that very much. I want to let everybody know who is fortunate enough to be on campuses. There are some snacks, I believe, that have been, hopefully, crossing my fingers, delivered to your rooms or your areas. So we're going to take just a short little break here. I think we've had we're pretty much on schedule. So Scott always said, you know, rope me in when I'm continuing to go on, and he did not today. So that's great. Thank you. I very much appreciated that. So let's take a little bit of a break. Because we did have a little break earlier. Let's come back at about 1:20, if that's okay with everybody. Get up, stretch your legs, turn your videos off, and we'll see you back shortly. Thank you. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We've just got 1 minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I just want to, we're going to hit this button. Michael just told me to do this and I didn't do it. So now I'd like to take the time to introduce Kona. Kona and I have only met virtually so far, but I consider her a very good friend and colleague. Dr. Kona Williams is Cree from Pegus First Nation and Mohawk from Ganawake. It's a great combination, I just want to add. She is a forensic pathologist and the coroner with the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service. Dr. Williams is the director of the Northeastern Regional Forensic Pathology Unit and the laboratory medical director for Health Sciences North, and is the First Nations liaison for Ontario. She is the co-chair of the Indigenous Health Committee of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, an executive board member of the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, a Canadian Medical Association ambassador, and a co-representative for the AFMC Network on Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto. Kona is also an assistant professor at NOSM. Dr. Williams was recently appointed to the Academic Council and served a term on the Senior Leadership Committee at HSN. Dr. Williams continues to address anti-Indigenous racism in Canada's healthcare systems at a national and international level and teaches fourth-year undergraduate course in forensic pathology at Laurentian University. Dr. Williams is a true champion for all medical learners across this country, nationally and internationally, and I'm honored to call her my friend and invite her up today to speak on her presentation, Empowering Indigenous People and Understanding Death Investigation, with focus on current events of mass and unmarked graves at and near Indian residential schools. Kona?
Hello, everybody. Everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you here.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to try sharing my screen. Okay, so it won't let me share it. I know I sent my PowerPoint. So would somebody put that up for me, please? Apologies.
No worries, we're on it, Kona.
Thank you.
There you go, you're up.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So I want to acknowledge the elder and also any survivors that we may have in attendance, the students, the learners, of course, and my colleagues for this. This is a little bit of a different presentation. There will be some forensic pathology. I am a forensic pathologist here up in Sudbury, and I deal with death. And I deal with death in a way that I look for truth about that. And it's a bit ironic that, you know, here I am, First Nations forensic pathologist, and I seem to be here at the right place and the right time. So I'd like to share some of what I know, both from being a First Nations person in this country, as well as being a forensic pathologist, and what it is that I can hopefully share with you about the intersection of those two very different worlds. Next slide, please. So this is what I learned growing up. I went to public school, and yeah, I learned about the provinces. I learned about Canada's history. I learned about all the things that I think many of us learned about when we were, you know, young, at least those of my vintage. And you know, Canada looked like a really happy place. There's all these pretty colors, and that's kind of what I learned. I learned absolutely nothing about residential schools. I didn't learn anything about Indigenous people or who was here first, aside from maybe like one day where they'd have like Indian Day, and we'd all, you know, make cardboard moccasins. It was really kind of pathetic, to be honest, but that was what I learned, and that is what I expected most of you know, people my age at least learned, and older learned about when they were going through school. Next slide. This is very different. This is a map by one of my friends. He put all of the nations in Canada that were known before colonization. And this is something that I think people need to keep in mind, is that we're very, very different. So from one end of the country to the other, Indigenous people have different languages and different histories, different traditions, different ceremonies, different protocols. We don't all look the same. That's something else that a lot of my colleagues, they seem to think that we should all look like, you know, the typical Indigenous person you might see in you know, on the news, or, you know, in cartoons. And the number of different First Nations, the First Nations specifically, there's so many of them, and even sister communities. So my mother's community in Kahnawake is still, you know, similar but quite different than their sister community in Nagwazasne, for example. So again, we're very, very different. And this comes into play when I start speaking about death, and the death specifically of Indigenous people. Next slide, please. There's a lot of pictures in this one, so you're just gonna have to hit enter. So this is my mother's community, or that was my mother's community. My cousin's in there somewhere, and they're protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this is a woman out in Manitoba, near the Red River, and she's hanging, you know, raising awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You can press enter again. And this is a reality. Despite everything that this country has and everything it has to offer, this is what comes out of the taps in a lot of communities across Canada. You know, the water is of terrible quality. It's undrinkable. And so there's many communities that are under a boil water advisory for, you know, decades. And, you know, just access to clean water is affects health. It affects, you know, people's, you know, enjoyment of their lives, unfortunately. And this is, again, this is reality. You press enter. And access to fresh water, access to available water can have devastating consequences in many communities, especially where, it's fly in only. And so you can imagine how expensive it might be to bring in good quality building materials for houses, and how difficult it may be to get trained people up there to build these houses. So unfortunately, a lot of these houses are built by the lowest, possible bidder, and they may not be up to code. And so you have a lot of fires. And if you don't have, access to running water, it's difficult for, anybody who's trained in fighting fires to get to these houses in time. A lot of these houses are overcrowded. The heating might not be great. There may be lots of, it can be dangerous. The building materials are flammable. And unfortunately, this is a common occurrence. And if this were to happen as often in places like Toronto, for example, we'd be hearing about it immediately, and it would be resolved within a matter of weeks or months. Whereas this has been an ongoing problem up in many of these northern communities for years. The next picture. And again, for those of you who are familiar with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, we heard the stories from families about what happened. And these stories hadn't really been heard before, or at least they weren't national. And the reality is this keeps happening. And it keeps happening, not just in Indigenous communities, but in urban communities, in all over the country. And it just seems as though, they kind of pop up in the news very quickly, and then they very quickly disappear. So our voices are, either they're not being heard, or they're not being, broadcast to the people who really need to hear them. Next slide. So I want to go over really quickly the Indian Act of the reserve system. You can just click until the bottom shows up, or the end of the slide. So for those of you who don't know, this has been federal law since 1876. And it arose from two different acts, the Gradual Civilization Act and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act. And if you think about what those words actually mean, you can understand why we have the Indian Act and the way it is today. Reserves are still held in trust by, for the bands by the Crown. And treaties were signed with often opposing expectations. So those, we entered into these treaties with the expectation that the land and the resources were going to be shared, whereas we know now that that wasn't exactly the case. Next slide, please. And you can go through all those, yeah, please. And what was the impact of the Indian Act? Well, you had reserves. You had residential schools, which operated for a very long time. And if you remember the Enfranchisement Act, if you went to university or had military service, you were no longer considered an Indian under the Indian Act. So if you can imagine, men and women who went into the First World War and fought to keep us safe, when they returned home, they no longer had a home to go to. They couldn't go back to their families. They couldn't live on reserve. They were no longer considered Indians under the Act. There was the pass system, which was in existence even when my father was alive, which meant that if you wanted to leave the reserve for any reason, you had to basically get like a hall pass and get permission. There's gender discrimination until about 1985, where until then, women, Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men lost their status. And it was the reverse for non-Indigenous women who married Indigenous men that would gain status. Now, this has been sort of removed. I say sort of because there's still quite a lot of gender discrimination in the Indian Act, but it's very paternalistic, whereas a lot of communities, a lot of Indigenous nations they have a matrilineal sort of society where the women are the ones, especially in my mother's society, in my mother's communities, the women are the ones who choose the leaders. And who better to choose the leaders of the communities and the women who raised them. The Indian Act prohibited First Nations languages and traditions, cultural ceremonies. They imposed band council. And I think there's one more at the bottom there, I'm not sure. If not, we can, oh yeah, and denied the right to vote until 1960. So that was even within my father's time. There was no right to vote. Next slide, please. Oh, and that one too. So this is Birtle Indian School. It's a residential school out in Manitoba. This is an old picture. Obviously, it's black and white. You know, looking at it, it doesn't look very inviting. It doesn't look very friendly. But I want you to keep this photo in mind just till the end. Next slide, please. And again, this is an old photo. I'm sure some of you have seen photos like this of children who attended these schools. And I just want to look at how young they are. Like some of them look like they're toddlers. And, you know, I can't imagine, I grew, like I said, I went to public school. So I can't imagine growing up away from my family at that age or at any age when you need your parents, you need your family, you need your grandparents, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles. To be supportive, and being taken away from that and everything that you knew and put in a school like this, especially one that looked like say Birtle, it's absolutely terrifying for these students. And you know, to me, they don't look very happy, and I don't blame them. Next slide, please. So here's another series, yeah, you can just go through. So the residential schools, they're instituted by the Canadian government in cooperation with the church under the Department of Indian Affairs. The whole point was to educate, civilize, and assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society and the Christian way of life. You had to go. There was no choice. You know, if you tried to hide your children, you could go to jail and they'd take them anyway. And this is all enforced by Indian agents. And as we know, about 150,000 children attended these schools across Canada. Next slide. And what was the impact of this? You know, children are forcibly removed. They're separated from their siblings while they attended these schools. They're punished for speaking their languages or practicing their culture, which is all they knew until then. There was overcrowding, what led to deaths from influenza and tuberculosis. Scientific experimentation was performed on malnourished students. There was forced sterilization. And of course, there were a lot of abuse and death. If you hit enter, whoops, no, you can go to the next ones. Okay, so many of us who are in medicine and are practicing or learners, if you think of one person who's suffered some sort of abuse or trauma in childhood or growing up, they're at much greater risk for all of these other things. So suicide or incarceration, mental health issues, violence, addictions. And so you think about that person, you think about how hard it is to treat that one person, and they may get better, they may not get better, or they may end up, unfortunately, a lot of people end up seeing people like me, like forensic pathologists. So if we go to the next slide. And you just hit enter again. Now imagine this happening, not just to one person, but over and over and over to generations of people, generations of families. And there's some communities out there where this has happened for 7 generations. So you can imagine, you know, the state of some of these communities, and you can understand why, at least from a clinical point of view, why there may be so many of these issues in these communities. And you know, access to services and all that, we know what it's like in the north. It's not great, but this has been going on for decades. And now you can kind of understand and appreciate the magnitude of the issues, but not just, don't only think about the, you know, the issues, the problems, the challenges. Think about the strength that it took for us to still be here, and we are still here. Next slide. So you can just keep hitting, yeah, until you see all three things in arrows. This is what I learned as a forensic pathologist. So there's this triangle of death. So people generally tend to fall into one or more of these categories when they die. So it could be natural disease, it could be injury, or it could be toxicity, or it could be a combination of any two, or even sometimes all three. And that's where things get really complicated, especially in court. But this is how I think of cases when I'm doing my work, and where they fall in this triangle that we call the triangle of death. And you can just click enter. There's some arrows and stuff, but you can go to the next slide. And you can hit enter 3 times, I think, because there's 3 different things here. Now this is more of I almost want to call it a triangle of death for Indigenous people, because when you think about the Indian Act and residential schools, and then you think about it in the context of the death investigation system, we've got healthcare, government, and law enforcement, and death investigation encompasses all 3 of those. So you can understand now the mistrust or the distrust and the lack of communication. And when people die, community members die, this is what you're facing. These agencies, which can be very forbidding or very intrusive to Indigenous communities, and within good reason, considering the history. Next slide. And this to me just represents strength. One of my friends, she painted this, and I just had to have it. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And she's done a couple other things for it. I'll show you down the road or later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, there's a bunch of photos here we can quickly go through. For those of you who haven't seen it, a lot of it is online. A lot of it was broadcast online live, as we're doing here. And there is a report. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it to really get some of the stories and the background and the pain and also the resilience of these women and their families in dealing with the reality of what's happening in this country even now. We can go to the next slide. For those of you who live in Thunder Bay or are joining us from that area, this river should be very familiar, and it should be familiar for other reasons. It's beautiful, but there's a lot of stories that come out of this river, and I'll just quickly go through some of them. Next slide, please. So Thunder Bay had, I don't know if they still have it, but they did have the highest homicide rate in Canada. A lot of them involve Indigenous people, and many of the cases, the criminally suspicious cases or homicides, they need to go to Toronto for autopsies. That's a long way. There's a lack of adequate forensic pathology services in Thunder Bay. They desperately need a forensic pathology unit proper, kind of like we have here in Sudbury. But it's hard. It takes 14 years to train one of us. So you can understand that, it's a long time coming, but I would hope that in the future, the forensic pathology service in Thunder Bay would be just as good as the kind of services you get in Toronto or places like Ottawa, some of the larger centers, because they really do need it. there's a lot that happens in Thunder Bay, and it's compounded by the lack of trust of the death investigation system and the police. Next slide, please. So why? What's happening in Thunder Bay? There was an inquest of the deaths of 7 Indigenous students in Thunder Bay. There's been an increase in homicide and criminally suspicious deaths of Indigenous people. And while this inquest was going on, there were 2 more deaths of Indigenous youth. And the Thunder Bay Police currently are under review for their practices in dealing with the deaths of Indigenous people. Next slide, please. Oh, and those 2, you should, if you don't know their names, you should by now. If you don't, then definitely use the Google. Every time I see these photos, my heart breaks. You should know who these young people are, as well as the gentleman in the right lower hand corner. This is Mr. DeBungy. And you have to think about this, not just, as individuals, but also as a systemic issue where these young people are dying in Thunder Bay. It also really hits home in terms of residential schools, because these students had to leave their communities to attend high school in Thunder Bay. And Thunder Bay has not always been very welcoming to Indigenous people. And you have to also consider the families. So these students are leaving, they're young, their parents are letting their best and their brightest go to get a better education, to, have a better future, and they still end up dead. And if you think about the similarities to residential school, this is still happening. It's still there. And this is going to be echoing in our generations for a very long time. And so I want you to remember these young people and these Indigenous people who died in Thunder Bay. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And for those of you who want to learn a little bit more about this, Tanya Talega has a book called The 7 Fallen Feathers. There's another documentary out on CBC right now about these cases and what it means to be young, Indigenous, and in a place like Thunder Bay. Next slide, please. So again, these 7 students, like I said, they attended school in Thunder Bay from their communities. So I want you to remember Jethro, Curran, Robin, Paul, Reggie, Kyle, Jordan, and also Stacy DeBungy and Barbara Kentner. 3 of the deaths were ruled accidental and 4 were undetermined. There's currently another review happening about these. The report is due soon, I hope. But read up on them, learn about these students. Next slide. And here it is again by the river. The people are remembering these young people and everybody who's died by this river, in Thunder Bay. Next slide. Again, my artist friend, she painted this for me. This actually lives in the large provincial unit down in Toronto. And it gives comfort to grieving families when they go there to learn. And it gives me comfort to know that it's there. And it's not just for Indigenous families, but for all families. Next slide. So some changes. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, TRC, MMIW, all of these reports are available. And again, if you haven't learned about them, now's the time. This is all available online. So it would be, I think every Canadian should have some knowledge of all these reports, so to really understand what happened. Next slide, please. So on to sort of quickly, what do we do? Now that we've learned about history, now we've learned about residential schools, now we learn about the impacts. Now with these grave sites being found, Dr. Hamilton did a fantastic job explaining what's happened with these sites to date, but what's next? So I'll go over that really quickly. So next slide, please. So I'm a forensic pathologist. And if we are going to actually start digging and start removing bones from the ground, you're going to need experts. So forensic pathologists like myself, forensic anthropologists, we work very closely together when we're dealing with bones. Lots of other experts as needed, geophysicists, archaeologists, geneticists. And I had asked, some of the higher government tables for an expert advisory committee at arm's length from the government to help provide oversight over these processes, these forensic processes, and advise families and communities as to the next steps. Like, what do we do next? Who do we talk to? Who are the right experts for this? There's unfortunately been some predatory companies that are going to communities and cold calling them saying, I've got a backhoe and I'll just dig up some bones and I'll do it for $100,000. It's not the right approach, and you need the right experts to do this kind of work. Next slide. So there's a whole bunch of phases. At the center, honestly, it should be led by the communities, the families, the survivors, the leadership, to ensure that communication is clear. There have to be local action plans, ethics have to be respected, and ceremony and protocol for each community, which will be different. We need documents, we need, some researchers, we need to listen to people. We need to listen to the survivors about, the possibility, where are these sites, what did they see? What documentation is out there, because we know that not all of it was, the documents provided by the church or the government may not be complete. Antemortem data. So from prospective families, this is probably going to include DNA, and the handling of that, the ethics around that, the challenges are huge. There's a multidisciplinary team which can exhume and examine the remains. And again, I went over who those people are. Identification and repatriation are big. So for my job, identification of the deceased is super important. And then, sending them home, making sure that we do that respectfully. And then what do we do with the bones that we can't identify and we can't send home because we just don't know who they are? These are realities of this whole process. And this has to be made clear to communities and family members and survivors that we may not get all the answers we can, or that are expected. Next slide, please. So these are really important points to consider for any community or anybody who's thinking about going the full forensic investigation. The wishes of the family and communities are central, they're paramount. And my involvement, our involvement in the death investigation system depends on their decisions. It's not the other way around. It's not something that can be imposed on anybody, because we've had enough of that already. The forensic work needs to be systematic, based on good practices. There are international best practices, and it needs to align with ethics, not just to the living, but also to the dead. Each step must respect the cultural and traditional values of each community. And that involves dialogue, it involves open communication, which is so important in death investigation, to make sure that everybody understands what the process is, what the next step should be, because it's going to be hard. There needs to be some involvement of mental health in this, because it's going to be traumatic to people. I'm trained in this, but it's still hard. And for communities who are not used to this kind of work, there needs to be that support system available, not just to survivors, but for everybody. And what needs to be really, really clear is it might not be possible to locate all the grave sites, as Dr. Hamilton indicated. Identifying each child may not be possible. And it may be even harder to determine exact cause of death. So what do we do? What do we do with those cases? What happens if one community wants a full forensic investigation and the other community, another community does not and wants to let the dead lie? But you have children from both communities in one gravesite. How do we negotiate that? How do we navigate those waters? How do we manage the expectations? How do we tell families that, you know what, we couldn't find them, or we don't know? This kind of information is sort of what I'm doing right now, explaining the realities, the possibilities, but also the limitations about what can and cannot be done. Next slide, please. Remember Birtle Residential School? This is Birtle today. And I wanted to show you this for one reason. If we go to the next slide, that's my dad. So he went to residential school. He went to Birtle specifically. And he survived so that I could be here. And I would not be in the position I am if he hadn't been there for me and did what he could to ensure that I got the education I did to now be able to do what I do now. So I owe a lot to him, and to all my family who went to these schools and who didn't make it, or who were affected and traumatized by it. So I owe them an awful lot. Next slide. That is the end. Just so you know, I was calling my friend Jackie. She's the one she's an incredible artist out in Manitoba, and she does all this artwork for me. She came up with this in like literally, 24 hours. I asked her because all I had was this blank, boring presentation with like no color on it. I had an orange circle, and I said, well, somebody can obviously do better than this. So Jackie came up with this in 24 hours, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I have to shout out to her, for helping me out with this. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
Hi, Dr. Williams. It's Danielle. I'm moderating for the question period at this point. So we do have a couple of questions. So Ghislaine said that she has a question and realizes it's a sensitive one. How do we as an institution ensure that researchers, specifically non-Indigenous researchers, respect the sacred work ahead and not, quote unquote, make their careers off of the discovery and the work ahead? What can we do to ensure there is no additional harms?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's actually something I was thinking about as this was going through, because it is something that, especially a lot of younger researchers might want to jump on because it is so huge. But again, it's not just one person. It needs to be done with the communities. It needs to be done respectfully and with their wishes. And if they decide, no, this isn't happening, or this isn't the right person for the job, or we want XYZ, then that has to be respected. Research is important, but it's the communities and the families, the survivors, the elders, the knowledge keepers who are going to be the ones directing how this works and how this happens. And so as long as that is respected, I think this work can be done collaboratively between all of us. And again, once you get into a forensic investigation, you're sort of, the research can happen, but then you're going to need the right investigators to do that. So it changes things quite a bit. Again, it's difficult to answer that question, but again, I think it does need to be guided and driven by the wishes of the communities it's affected, because they're still alive. We're still here.
Great. Okay, one last question. We have 2 minutes. So from Brooke, thank you for the excellent presentation. I have read in some texts the concept that by definition, reconciliation implies the restoration of a relationship that was once amicable, and that the term does not really apply to the relationship between Canada and the Indigenous peoples, as historically this relationship was founded on deceit, as we have discussed in today's presentation. This has stuck with me and has created a feeling of animosity when various politicians and organizations throw around the term reconciliation to push forward their own agenda without producing much of any action. From your experience, do you have any advice for how we can keep governments and organizations accountable to promises they make, such as the calls to action in the TRC?
That's a big one too. I mean, I've always thought you can't really have reconciliation without responsibility and without acknowledging that responsibility and acknowledging what actually happened. It's like, yeah, we'll issue an apology, but nothing's going to change. The accountability has to be there before you can have reconciliation. And that hasn't happened yet, really. So it's up to, and I think it's on the government of Canada and the church and all the institutions who are involved in this to be held accountable and to step up to that accountability before discussing reconciliation. You have to actually say, okay, yeah, this happened. We're responsible. And how do we deal with it? And then move on to reconciliation. A lot of people want to move on, jump to the end right away. And that's not always the best way to go, especially when there's still so many people who are suffering from the effects of this whole system.
Thanks very much. I get the feeling that room 1011 is no longer connected. I don't see them.
Make a comment that time.
A very, very short one. We're already past our time, sir, but go ahead.
2 seconds.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, your expertise on science. I attended St. Joseph Residential School. Building has been demolished and there's no property there no more. I wanted to go there and try to create some kind of refreshing my memory of what happened there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not there no more. Would that score as a fact that the evidence in that school was destroyed? You know, my other question is your job. You know, you're sanctioned by the government to do your job, investigate. Sometimes that limited what you could do. There, international community that supports this whole idea of being, those missing children. That's what I like. Yeah.
So I think the first question, we're not going to know until we go there. We're not going to know what we're going to find. And I think those sites need to be protected until we see what we see. And that could involve either a site survey or it could go all the way to a full forensic investigation if that's, what's requested. To the second question, so there is a lot of interest from outside of Canada, from other forensic experts, in the U.S., across, in other countries. But we do have forensic experts here now. So we have a good forensic system, especially here in Ontario, which can, I've been trained by some of the best in the world at what I do. And so I think we should definitely tap into the expertise and the resources we have here. And if we need the support of outside sources, then, I don't think there'd be any lack of offers from others if we needed it.
Thanks very much, Dr. Williams, for your response. Given that we're at the end of time, I'd like to pass it over to Elder Ozawagosh to close our session today. Thank you.
Ani, Bosho, Wache, Sego. I just want to thank Dr. Williams and Dr. Hamilton for their presentation. It's very interesting and very enlightening, you know, of a lot of the questions and conversations that's been happening since the bodies were uncovered, and you know the processes, and I think it's very heartfelt work that Dr. Williams is doing, you know, like when you know, looking at the bodies, and because that can be very sensitive and caring that needs to happen, you know, for those little bodies. So, you know, I want to thank you for your work, and you know your kindness and your caring and your compassion, you know, for the families and for those little bodies, you know, those little spirits that never made it home. So I just want to say miigwech to, you know, to both of you for the work that you do. Aposho, wabana kwende de goji jak do de, shemnedo mishom saknok misak. Miigwech de kitme, minoi, ibi bin gig. Kibenat mos young man that can go gasha no the man. When it is gagin well, you should deb wait toing. Manda can go ni go the kid winning. Manda can go gasham the man. Miigwech in the kitme. Miigwech gay the kitme on the kinna game up a yajik nunga. Gay we give us under moin gay mother can go. Gay we not mos young gay we should ken the big mother can go gasha buck. Minos gay me quen man on the gay on the pinochi suck gay gam chaosot. Not more go this gay way that we should go snot or the king. Out to me wetch mother can go gay go. Shem the do mat me wetch gay mother gishat. Ha me wetch. So we give thanks to the Creator, to the grandmothers and the grandfathers for all the what we heard today, all this truth and all the words that we take and to pay attention to, and to be mindful of, you know, of our of everyone, you know, and who we meet, and you know who sometimes are those invisible ones, to acknowledge, you know, that they're validated. So for all of that, you know, we give thanks for everyone that's here, that you know that came to listen, and you know, to have that awareness and have some education, and continue to, you know, to do that work, and you know, to explore, you know, the history of and the truth of residential school, because I think for the longest time that you know, lots of comments were put out to, you know, to say to get over it. But with with the uncovering of these bodies, it shows Canada and the world that, you know, that residential school happened, and that the grieving of the families and communities that, you know, all these missing children, you know, never came home. So it brought out the truth, and now that you know, that this day means more than, you know, of it, you know, like maybe 2-3 years ago, but it has a more in-depth of feeling and awareness, and that love, you know, to share, you know, and to bring everything forward, and you know, to have that honest conversation, and you know, not to have that judgment, and all of that. You know, we give our gratitude for this beautiful day. Ahau miigwech, miigwech, miigwech.
Miigwech, Julie. I hope folks can hear me. I had to just transition to my laptop and run down the hall a little bit, but I'm here, and Yolanda is making her way to our ATAC office. So We're so appreciative of everyone's presence and participation in the whole school event, acknowledging the first day, or the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. One day early is this event, so tomorrow is the actual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Those of us who wish to stay online, we will be staying online with Julie. We will be turning the recording off at this point. So folks who want to stay are welcome to stay. If you need to go on to other things in your day, please feel free. And we are, like I said, so appreciative. I'm not sure if folks have been noticing in the chat, I've been populating a link that maybe was a little glitchy at the start, but thanks to my colleagues helped me work it out, and it should be available to you. It is the same link. If you'd like to share some comments or some feedback, we'd welcome them there. And we'll try to make that link available to others, either through our other publications as well as loading it up to our website. But this concludes the whole school event portion of today. And those of us who would like to stay are welcome to stay with Julie and myself and any others who are wanting to stay for a bit of discussion and rebalance. So Chimigwech, everybody, big thank you. Bamapi Minwa Kawamin. See you again later.
Hi, Sally. This is Aaron here. Would you like
Hi,
me to
Aaron.
end the live stream to YouTube at the same time as well?
Yes, I would. Are we able to stop the recording?
Yes,
Okay, is that me or can you do that?
I've taken over the host role, so I will do it.
Thank you.
Recording is stopped.